Jacob had never imagined that a single ordinary morning could change the course of his life. It was a quiet, typical Saturday in their small town, where the air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the hum of nearby cars passing by. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, glancing at the paper, and enjoying the peace. Megan, his wife of 15 years, moved around the kitchen, preparing breakfast for their daughter, Ella, who was still in bed, catching up on sleep after a busy week at school. Jacob had always been a simple man. He didn't crave excitement or dramatic moments in his life. A steady job as a mechanic, a warm home, and a loving family were enough to make him feel fulfilled. The world outside seemed to pass by without much change, but that was okay with Jacob. He liked it that way. He appreciated the small things, the way Megan's laugh filled the house, the sparkle in Ella's eyes when she had something to tell him, the sense of pride he felt when he worked on a car and made it run like new. That was his life, and he was content. Megan, on the other hand, had always been a bit more unpredictable. She had a natural charm that made everyone around her feel at ease, but there was something mysterious about her too. She never spoke much about her past, and Jacob never pressed her. They had built their life together, and that was what mattered. She had her own secrets, but Jacob didn't mind. Everyone had their own things they preferred to keep hidden, right? He believed in letting people have their space. He trusted Megan completely. The morning had started like any other. Jacob had kissed Megan on the cheek before leaving the bedroom and sat down to his usual breakfast of eggs and toast. Megan flitted around the kitchen, humming a tune under her breath, as she made a cup of tea for herself. Ella, still wrapped in the warm comfort of her blankets, was going to sleep in a little longer. "Are you sure you don't want me to make you something?" Megan asked as she handed him his plate. Jacob smiled. "I'm good, babe. Just coffee and some eggs. You know I'm not picky." Megan chuckled, brushing her hair out of her face. "All right, well, I'm heading out for a bit. Got some errands to run. Tom's place is hosting a little gathering for the neighbors, and I'll pop by there afterward. Don't wait up." Jacob nodded as he took a bite of his eggs. "Sounds good. Let me know if you need anything." Megan didn't say much else as she grabbed her purse, kissed Jacob on the cheek, and left. Jacob watched her go, feeling a bit of warmth in his chest as he always did when she smiled at him. Life was good. As the hours ticked by, Jacob focused on his work. He had a few cars lined up at the shop, and he was determined to make sure they were in perfect condition. He loved his job, especially on days like this when everything seemed to run smoothly. Tom led him into the living room, where a strange silence hung in the air. Jacob took a glance around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt off. The air was thick, and Tom's anxiety was palpable. "I was going to look for her," Tom said, his voice shaky. "But I found something when I went into the house, something that doesn't make sense." Jacob froze. "What do you mean?" Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured for Jacob to follow him to the back of the house. He led him to the guest bedroom, where an unexpected sight greeted Jacob's eyes. There, scattered across the floor, were dozens of papers. Bank statements, credit card bills, and what appeared to be legal documents that Jacob had never seen before. A quick glance revealed names, figures, and numbers that seemed to mean nothing to him. But there was one that stood out, a document that was addressed to Jacob's father, a man who had disappeared from their lives years ago. The papers mentioned something about offshore accounts and money transfers, none of which made sense to Jacob. "What is this, Tom?" Jacob's voice trembled. "What is all of this?" Tom looked up, his face full of confusion. "I don't know. But this isn't something Megan would leave out like this." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of the situation. What was Megan hiding? Why had she left all of this behind? And what was the connection to his father? Jacob couldn't find the answers, but he knew one thing: this was just the beginning. Something far bigger was happening, and it was about to change everything. As the room spun with unanswered questions, Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in. Everything he thought he knew about his life, and about Megan, was about to unravel. Jacob stood frozen in the guest bedroom, his eyes fixed on the scattered papers that seemed to swirl in his mind like a chaotic storm. The documents, all of them incongruent and strange, left him feeling more bewildered than ever. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up one of the papers, feeling its weight in his palm. The financial statements meant nothing to him, yet they were somehow tied to a world he thought he had left behind, his estranged father. The name on the document, linked to foreign bank accounts and offshore transfers, felt like a jolt through his entire body. How did this relate to Megan? Was this why she had been acting distant lately? Was this the secret she had kept hidden for so long? Tom's voice broke through Jacob's thoughts. I don't know what any of this means, but I'm starting to get worried. You said she was supposed to be here today, right? Where the hell is she? Jacob's gaze snapped to Tom. Yeah, she said she was just running errands. But now I don't even know what's going on. His voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. Tom took a step back, running a hand through his hair. This doesn't make sense. Megan's never kept secrets from you before, right? Jacob shook his head, his mind a swirl of confusion. No. She's never been like this. I don't know what's going on, but something feels off. Tom, still looking at the papers with a frown, said, maybe we should try calling her again. Something doesn't sit right with me. Jacob nodded and pulled out his phone, his heart pounding as he scrolled through his contacts. He hit Megan's name and pressed the phone to his ear. The dial tone seemed to stretch on for an eternity before the voicemail message clicked in. Hey, it's Megan. I can't take your call right now, leave a message. Jacob's stomach sank as the beep sounded. Megan, it's me. I'm at Tom's. Where are you? Please call me. I'm starting to get worried. He hung up, his fingers stiff as he placed the phone back into his pocket. Tom was pacing now, muttering under his breath. This just doesn't make sense. She wouldn't leave without telling you. And why did she leave all this stuff here? What if something happened to her? Jacob's mind was reeling. What was happening? He never imagined that an afternoon like this would lead him down a rabbit hole of confusion and fear. Megan had always been the kind of person who could handle things on her own. Even if she had something on her mind, she would always talk to him about it. But this was different. She hadn't told him anything. And now, he was standing here, staring at documents that didn't belong in his life. The more he thought about it, the more the question burned in his mind: what had Megan been hiding? And why had she felt the need to keep this from him? Was there a hidden life, a secret world she had been living in, that he didn't know about? The answer wasn't coming to him, and the feeling of helplessness was becoming overwhelming. Jacob turned toward Tom. I need to go look for her, he said, his voice hoarse. This isn't just about papers and money. Something's wrong. Tom nodded, his expression grim. I agree. We should check the places she might have gone, if she went anywhere. Maybe someone has seen her. Jacob didn't hesitate. Without another word, he walked out the door, his mind racing with questions. Where could Megan have gone? What had she been involved in? He didn't know where to start, but he knew he couldn't sit around waiting for answers. Every second that passed made him feel more disconnected from the woman he thought he knew so well. The drive through town was a blur. Jacob's thoughts were consumed by the discovery in Tom's house, the papers, and the way Megan had acted so strangely over the past few weeks. It wasn't like her to be distant. She had always been the one to keep the family grounded, the one who kept the home filled with love and light. But now, everything about her behavior seemed to have changed. What had driven her to do this? What had she become involved in that was so serious she couldn't share it with him? Jacob passed the familiar landmarks of their small town, the corner store where they bought their groceries, the park where they had once taken Ella on lazy Sunday afternoons. Everything seemed the same, yet everything felt different. The walls of his mind were closing in, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He arrived at the local diner, a small, family-owned establishment where they often had breakfast on weekends. Maybe someone here had seen something. Megan had come here a few times over the past few days, so it felt like a logical place to start. He parked the car, his pulse quickening with the anticipation of finding something, anything, that could explain where she was. Inside, the bell above the door chimed as Jacob stepped into the diner. The familiar smell of coffee and pancakes hit him, but it didn't bring the comfort it usually did. The diner was relatively quiet for a Saturday afternoon, with only a few patrons scattered around. At the counter sat an elderly man who had been a regular for years, and the waitress, Carla, was cleaning off a table. Jacob approached the counter, his eyes scanning the room, his chest tight with anxiety. "Hey, Carla," he greeted her, forcing a smile. "Have you seen Megan today? She was supposed to stop by." Carla paused for a moment, her eyes darting around the diner as if she were searching for something. "Megan? Yeah, she came in this morning for breakfast. She didn't stay long, though. Said she had errands to run, and then she left." Jacob felt a jolt of frustration. That was the same story he had heard already, but something about Carla's tone made him wonder if there was more to it. Did she seem off? Or was everything normal? Carla looked thoughtful for a moment, then shook her head. Nah, nothing seemed off. She was fine. But, she did mention something about having to meet someone later. Didn't say who, though. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. Did she mention where she was going? Carla shrugged, clearly unsure. No, she didn't say. But she left in a hurry. Didn't seem like her usual self, though. You know, she's always so bubbly and chatty. Today, she was quiet. Almost like she was in a hurry to get somewhere. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. Did she leave with anyone? Carla shook her head again. No, just her. She walked out, got in her car, and left. That's all I know. Jacob's mind was spinning. Megan had said she was running errands, but now it seemed like there was something more. Someone she was meeting, somewhere she was going. Who was it? And why hadn't she told him about it? What was she hiding? The unanswered questions piled up, each one heavier than the last. Jacob thanked Carla, paid for his coffee, and left the diner, his thoughts a tangled mess of possibilities. He had to find her. He couldn't stand the thought of losing her, not after everything they had been through. As he drove through the streets, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, hoping it was Megan, finally reaching out to let him know she was okay. But it wasn't her. It was a text from an unknown number. Jacob, you need to stop looking for Megan. You're getting too close. If you don't leave things alone, there will be consequences. His fingers trembled as he read the message again. What did it mean? Who was this person? And why were they threatening him? Jacob slammed the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. There was something far more dangerous at play. Someone didn't want him to find Megan, and that made everything even more urgent. He couldn't stop now. He wouldn't. With newfound resolve, Jacob put the car back in gear and headed toward the next place he could think of, Megan's childhood friend, Rachel. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it was her. Jacob's mind raced as he sped toward Rachel's house, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were turning white. The text message was like a warning shot, a stark reminder that the situation was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. As he passed the familiar streets of their small town, a sense of urgency overtook him. Time was slipping away, and he couldn't afford to wait around any longer. Every second that passed without Megan was another second he feared something terrible had happened. He reached Rachel's house in record time, slamming the car into park and jumping out before it even fully stopped. The door to Rachel's house was slightly ajar, and he didn't bother knocking. He pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out her name. "Rachel? Are you here?" His voice echoed through the house, but there was no immediate response. Jacob's heart was pounding in his chest as he scanned the living room, the kitchen, and the hallway. There were signs of life, clothes on the couch, dishes in the sink, but no sign of Rachel herself. The house felt eerily quiet. Jacob's instincts told him something wasn't right. He moved toward the back of the house, checking each room as he went. When he reached the guest bedroom, he paused. The door was shut, and the light was on. Something told him Rachel might be inside. He knocked lightly before opening the door, only to be greeted by a sight that made his blood run cold. Rachel was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands wringing in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying. But it wasn't her emotional state that caught Jacob's attention, it was the open laptop in front of her and the scattered papers on the bed. "Rachel," Jacob said, his voice softer now as he approached her. "What's going on? Where's Megan?" Rachel looked up at him with a startled expression, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and regret. She took a deep breath, but her words didn't come easily. I didn't want to be the one to tell you this, Jacob," she began, her voice trembling. "But I think you need to know the truth." Jacob's heart sank. "What truth? What are you talking about?" Rachel's gaze dropped to her hands, and she swallowed hard. "Megan, she's involved in something. Something bad. And I think she's in danger." Jacob felt his stomach twist in knots. "What do you mean, something bad? What's going on, Rachel? Where is she? Tell me." Rachel's eyes flickered up to meet his, and she hesitated for a long moment. Then, as if the weight of her words could no longer be contained, she spoke again. "I've known for a while, Jacob. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't know how you would react. Megan didn't want you to get involved. But it's bigger than both of you now." Jacob's chest tightened. "What are you talking about? What has she gotten involved in?" Rachel took a shaky breath. "Megan's been working with someone. Someone dangerous. They've been laundering money. I don't know all the details, but it's big. It involves people you don't want to mess with, Jacob." Jacob stared at Rachel in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. "Money laundering? Are you serious?" His voice cracked with the weight of the accusation. Why would Megan be involved in something like that? Rachel nodded, her face twisted with worry. "She didn't have a choice, Jacob. She got in too deep. It started small, but it grew. The more she tried to get out, the more they pulled her back in. She didn't want to tell you because she was scared. She thought it would ruin everything." Jacob felt his head spin. He had never suspected that Megan, the woman he loved, could be involved in something like this. She had always been so good, so honest. The thought of her being involved in criminal activity was almost impossible to accept. But Rachel's expression was serious, and the fear in her eyes was undeniable. She wasn't lying. I don't know what to say," Jacob muttered, his voice low. "This doesn't make sense. Why would she keep something like this from me? Why didn't she tell me?" Rachel shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. She was trying to protect you. She didn't want you to get caught up in it. She's in danger, Jacob. They've already threatened her. I don't know who they are, but they're dangerous. You can't go to the police. You have to trust me on that. Jacob's mind was reeling. Everything he thought he knew about Megan was crashing down around him. The woman he had shared his life with, the woman he thought he could trust above all others, had been keeping secrets. And not just any secrets, secrets that could tear apart everything they had built together. Where is she now? Jacob demanded, his voice growing more desperate. Is she in danger right now? Rachel's expression darkened. I don't know, Jacob. She's been hiding out, trying to figure out a way out. She's been staying with someone, but I don't know who. She won't tell me. Jacob ran his hands through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. I have to find her, Rachel. I can't just sit here and do nothing. Rachel looked at him with pleading eyes. Please, Jacob. Don't get involved. If you go looking for her, they'll come after you, too. You're not safe. None of us are. But Jacob wasn't listening. The fear for Megan's safety had consumed him. He couldn't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix things. He had to find her, no matter the cost. I can't sit here and do nothing. I need to find Megan. Without another word, Jacob turned and stormed out of the room, determined to find his wife, even if it meant putting himself in danger. He didn't know who these people were, or how deep the situation ran, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to lose her. Not like this. He got into his car, slamming the door shut behind him, and drove toward the only lead he had, the strange text message he had received earlier. The one warning him to stay away from Megan. Someone knew something. Someone was trying to stop him from getting answers. Jacob's mind raced as he sped through the town. He didn't know where he was going, but the overwhelming need to find Megan drove him forward. As the minutes passed, he felt the tension building in his chest. The further he drove, the more uncertain he became. Who was behind this? What had Megan gotten herself into? The streets seemed to blur as Jacob's thoughts continued to spiral. He had no clear plan, no direction, just an overwhelming sense of urgency. He needed answers. He needed to know where she was and what had happened to her. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was no longer just about finding his wife. This was about something much bigger. Every street sign, every passing car, every unfamiliar turn felt like a step closer to finding the truth. The darkness was closing in, and Jacob couldn't help but wonder if he was walking into something far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. But there was no turning back now. He drove through the night, fueled by fear and desperation, determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost him. Jacob's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, every passing mile a reminder of the fear and uncertainty gnawing at his gut. He had no idea where Megan was, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't stop until he found her. The silence of the car seemed to amplify his racing thoughts as he processed everything Rachel had told him. Megan, the woman he had trusted with his heart, his life, she was involved in something far darker than he could have ever imagined. And now, she was missing. The minutes on the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, his eyes darting between the dimly lit streets, trying to make sense of the puzzle pieces Rachel had given him. Money laundering. Threats. People who would stop at nothing to silence her. The more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. How could Megan, of all people, have gotten involved in something like this? He turned onto a narrow road that led away from the town, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the car. He had no particular destination, just a sense of instinct driving him forward, making turns based on nothing but gut feeling. But when he passed an old, run-down gas station on the outskirts of town, something caught his eye, a flash of movement near the abandoned warehouse next door. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The warehouse had always been a place of local gossip, the kind of place where rumors about shady dealings and backdoor operations floated around. But it wasn't just the warehouse that caught his attention, it was the silhouette of a woman standing in front of it, her posture tense, her figure instantly recognizable even in the dim light. Megan. He slammed the brakes, the tires screeching in protest as the car came to a sudden stop. He didn't think twice before throwing the car into park and jumping out, not even bothering to lock it. Every step he took toward the warehouse seemed to echo louder in the dead silence of the night. His breath caught in his throat as he approached Megan, his heart thudding in his chest. "Megan," he called out, his voice breaking through the stillness of the night. Megan's head snapped up, her eyes wide in surprise. She took a step back, as if startled by his sudden appearance, but then her expression softened, and she closed the distance between them. "Jacob, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and fear. She looked over her shoulder nervously, as if checking for someone, or something. "I came for you," he replied, his voice firm despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "I'm not letting you face this alone. I don't care what's going on, we'll figure it out together." Megan's face darkened, and she grabbed his arm, pulling him slightly away from the warehouse. "You shouldn't have come, Jacob. You don't understand what you're dealing with. These people," she broke off, her eyes darting around once more. "They'll do anything to make sure you don't get involved. You don't know who they are." "I don't care who they are," Jacob shot back, his voice rising. "I care about you. And I'm not going to just sit by while you get dragged into this mess. What's really going on, Megan? What's the truth?" Megan hesitated, her eyes welling with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped herself, biting her lip as if trying to find the right words. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice low and strained. "It started off small, Jacob. I got involved with someone who promised me an easy way out of debt. It seemed harmless at first, a little money on the side, no one would ever know. But then it grew bigger, and I couldn't get out. I tried, I really did, but every time I thought I was free, they pulled me back in. They threatened me, Jacob. They threatened you, too." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean, they threatened me? Why didn't you tell me?" "I couldn't," she cried, her voice cracking. "I couldn't tell you, Jacob. I thought if I kept you out of it, you'd be safe. But now, I see I was wrong. I never should have kept you in the dark." Jacob took her hands in his, squeezing them tightly. "Megan, we can fix this. We'll go to the authorities. We'll—" "No." Megan interjected, her eyes wide with panic. "You can't. If we go to the authorities, they'll come after you. They'll come after everyone I love. This isn't something we can just hand over to the police. They're too powerful, too connected." Jacob could feel the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just a simple mistake or a misunderstanding. Whatever this was, it was dangerous, and it had already cost Megan more than she could handle. "Megan, you don't have to do this alone," Jacob said, his voice softening. "We'll figure it out together, okay? I'll protect you. I'll keep you safe." But even as he spoke the words, a part of him wasn't sure if they could outrun whatever had been set in motion. This was bigger than either of them. They had no idea who these people were or what they were capable of. Jacob could see the fear in Megan's eyes, the same fear that had driven her to push him away in the first place. "We have to leave, Jacob," Megan whispered urgently, glancing around once more. "We have to go now before it's too late." Without another word, she grabbed his hand and began pulling him away from the warehouse. Jacob's mind raced as they hurried down the street, their footsteps quickening as the night seemed to close in around them. He didn't know where they were going, or what they would do once they got there, but for the first time since this entire ordeal started, he felt the weight of the situation crash down on him. As they reached the edge of town, Megan led him to a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts, far from prying eyes. She knocked on the door 3 times, and after a long moment, it creaked open, revealing a man in his late 40s, wearing a weathered jacket and a look of cautious recognition. "Megan?" the man asked, his voice low. "Is everything okay?" "I need your help," Megan replied, her voice tight with fear. "I can't keep running. We need a place to stay, just for tonight." The man nodded grimly, stepping aside to let them in. "Come on in, then. But you two better keep your heads down. They've been asking around, and I don't trust them not to come looking." Jacob felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he stepped into the house. It was small, sparsely furnished, and smelled faintly of mildew. But there was a sense of safety here, a feeling that, for the first time in a long while, they weren't being hunted. As Megan sat down at the small kitchen table, her face pale and drawn, Jacob couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning. The people Megan was running from weren't going to give up easily. They would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, and now, Jacob was caught in the middle of a war he never asked for. Megan looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Thank you for coming after me," she whispered. "I don't deserve it." "You're my wife," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "I'll never let you go through this alone. We'll find a way out, I promise." But as the hours passed in the dimly lit house, Jacob couldn't help but wonder just how deep this dangerous web went. The more he learned, the more he realized they were up against something far larger than they could comprehend. And the road ahead was only going to get darker. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jacob, each one merging into the next as he tried to make sense of the whirlwind of danger and uncertainty that had engulfed his life. Megan had been right to warn him. These people weren't playing around. They weren't just some small-time criminals, they were connected to a network that extended far beyond what Jacob could have imagined. The more they uncovered, the more he realized how deep he was in it now. There was no turning back. No matter how hard he tried to stay out of it, the threat loomed over them, suffocating him with every passing moment. The small house on the outskirts of town, where they had taken refuge, had become their temporary sanctuary. The man who had let them in, Caleb, seemed to know more about what was happening than he let on. He was cautious, always watching over his shoulder, never fully trusting even the walls around them. Jacob couldn't blame him. He had been in hiding for years, ever since he'd gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd himself. Caleb had once been part of the same underground network Megan had found herself involved with, but he had made it out. Barely. And now, he was trying to protect them from making the same mistakes he had. "Megan, you need to understand something," Caleb had said one evening, his voice low, as he pulled Jacob aside. "You're not just running from people who want to hurt you. You're running from a system that controls everything. They own half the businesses in town, they have connections in law enforcement, and they have people everywhere. You think you can just run? You can't. They'll find you, and they'll make you pay for this." Jacob had swallowed hard, the weight of Caleb's words sinking into his chest. He had always thought of small towns as safe, quiet places where nothing much happened. But now, every corner seemed to be watched, every phone call was a potential trap. He couldn't shake the feeling that even the walls of this place weren't safe. Meanwhile, Megan had been distant, withdrawn. Her eyes were constantly darting around, as though every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind was a sign that someone was coming for them. Her initial relief when she had reached the safety of Caleb's house had faded quickly into a palpable sense of dread. She barely spoke to Jacob about what had really happened, what she had been forced to do. The money laundering, the threats, the people she had gotten involved with, it all seemed to weigh on her, and Jacob could see it in the way she held herself. But what troubled him the most was the look in her eyes, her guilt. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jacob, each one merging into the next as he tried to make sense of the whirlwind of danger and uncertainty that had engulfed his life. Megan had been right to warn him, these people weren't playing around. They weren't just some small-time criminals, they were connected to a network that extended far beyond what Jacob could have imagined. The more they uncovered, the more he realized how deep he was in it now. There was no turning back. No matter how hard he tried to stay out of it, the threat loomed over them, suffocating him with every passing moment. The small house on the outskirts of town, where they had taken refuge, had become their temporary sanctuary. The man who had let them in, Caleb, seemed to know more about what was happening than he let on. He was cautious, always watching over his shoulder, never fully trusting even the walls around them. Jacob couldn't blame him. He had been in hiding for years, ever since he'd gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd himself. Caleb had once been part of the same underground network Megan had found herself involved with, but he had made it out. Barely. And now, he was trying to protect them from making the same mistakes he had. "Megan, you need to understand something," Caleb had said one evening, his voice low, as he pulled Jacob aside. "You're not just running from people who want to hurt you. You're running from a system that controls everything. They own half the businesses in town, they have connections in law enforcement, and they have people everywhere. You think you can just run? You can't. They'll find you, and they'll make you pay for this." Jacob had swallowed hard, the weight of Caleb's words sinking into his chest. He had always thought of small towns as safe, quiet places where nothing much happened. But now, every corner seemed to be watched, every phone call was a potential trap. He couldn't shake the feeling that even the walls of this place weren't safe. Meanwhile, Megan had been distant, withdrawn. Her eyes were constantly darting around, as though every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind was a sign that someone was coming for them. Her initial relief when she had reached the safety of Caleb's house had faded quickly into a palpable sense of dread. She barely spoke to Jacob about what had really happened, what she had been forced to do. The money laundering, the threats, the people she had gotten involved with, it all seemed to weigh on her, and Jacob could see it in the way she held herself. But what troubled him the most was the look in her eyes, her guilt. "Megan," Jacob said, his voice firm, "we need to act. We need to get out of here, and we need to do it now. They know where we are, and if we don't leave, they're going to." Before he could finish, the sound of heavy footsteps outside the door interrupted him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he turned to Caleb, who was already reaching for a gun tucked away in a drawer. "We're not getting out of this without a fight," Caleb muttered, his hand steady on the handle. "But I'm not going to let them take you. Not after everything we've been through." Jacob could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Megan anymore. This was about survival. And the decisions they made in the next few minutes would determine whether they walked out of here alive or if they were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. As the door handle began to turn, Jacob steeled himself for what was to come. This was it, the moment where they either fought back or gave in to the fear that had been chasing them all along. He reached for Megan's hand, gripping it tightly, and prepared for whatever was coming next. The tension in the room was unbearable. The door creaked as the handle turned, and the soft shuffle of footsteps echoed outside. Jacob's pulse quickened, his heart racing in anticipation of what would come next. The silence that followed felt deafening, as if the entire world had stopped spinning for just a moment. Caleb's grip on the gun tightened, and Jacob couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision that was about to unfold. They had come this far, but now it felt as though they were standing at the edge of an abyss, with no clear path forward. Megan's hand in his was trembling, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she gripped his hand tighter, as though it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was also a determination there, a spark that Jacob hadn't seen in her for days. It was as if, in that moment, she had come to a realization, they were past the point of no return. There was no turning back now. They had to face whatever was coming, together. The door swung open with a soft groan, revealing two men standing in the doorway. They were tall, their faces masked by shadows, but the look in their eyes was unmistakable. They had been sent here for one reason only, to find them, to finish what had been started. The men didn't need to speak, their presence alone spoke volumes. Caleb's hand remained steady on the gun, but Jacob could see the hesitation in his eyes. These weren't just any thugs. These were the people who ran the operation, the ones who had a hand in everything: money laundering, illegal arms deals, human trafficking. They were the ones who had made Megan's life a living hell. And now, they had found them. "Caleb," one of the men said, his voice cold and calm, like he was talking to an old friend. "We've been looking for you." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The man knew Caleb, which only made the situation more dangerous. Caleb had been hiding from these people for years, and now, it seemed, they had finally tracked him down. The man's gaze shifted to Jacob and Megan, and a cold smile spread across his face. "And who do we have here?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "The infamous couple who thought they could run. You really thought you could escape?" Jacob stood tall, his fear simmering beneath the surface. He had no idea who these men were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear: they were not going to back down. Caleb, however, wasn't so easily intimidated. He didn't flinch as he met the man's gaze. "Leave them out of this," Caleb said, his voice low but steady. "You want me, then take me. But leave them alone." The man chuckled, a low, sinister sound that sent a shiver down Jacob's spine. "It's too late for that. You should have stayed in hiding, Caleb. You shouldn't have come back. You and your little friends are part of something much bigger now. And there's no escape. We're here for all of you." Jacob could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. This wasn't just about Caleb. It wasn't even about Megan anymore. They had become pawns in a much larger game, one that they hadn't been prepared for. And now, it seemed, there was no way out. Caleb's hand tightened around the gun. "If you think for 1 second that you can take us without a fight, you're gravely mistaken." The tension in the room was palpable. Jacob could feel the electricity crackling in the air, the anticipation of something big about to happen. He glanced at Megan, whose eyes were locked on the men in the doorway. Her face was pale, but there was a new strength there, a resolve that hadn't been there before. She wasn't going to let them win. Not without a fight. Before anyone could move, the sound of a car engine revving outside broke the silence. It was a sharp, guttural sound, followed by the screech of tires on gravel. Caleb's eyes flicked toward the window, his face a mask of confusion. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered under his breath. Jacob's heart skipped a beat as the sound grew louder. It wasn't just one car. It was a convoy. Several vehicles were pulling into the driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The men in the doorway looked just as surprised as Caleb, their expressions shifting from confidence to uncertainty. "What's going on?" one of them asked, his voice rising in alarm. Caleb took a step forward, his gun still in hand. "Get ready. This isn't over." Suddenly, the door burst open with a loud crash, and several figures rushed into the room, moving with the precision of a well-coordinated team. Jacob barely had time to react as one of them tackled the man closest to him, knocking him to the ground. A fight erupted in an instant, the room filling with the sounds of grunts, shouts, and the scuffle of bodies. Caleb, now in his element, was quick to react, his gun already aimed at the remaining men. In the chaos, Jacob couldn't tell who was friend or foe, but it didn't matter. They were all fighting for their lives. Megan grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the fray. "We need to go," she said urgently. "Now." Jacob didn't hesitate. He followed her toward the back door, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. They were being rescued, but by who? And why had they shown up now? He didn't know the answers, but he didn't have time to ask questions. The fight was still raging inside the house, and they needed to escape before it escalated further. As they ran through the darkened yard, Jacob could hear the sounds of chaos behind them. The muffled thuds of fists hitting flesh, the sharp crack of a gunshot, and the distant roar of engines. He knew they didn't have much time. The men they had just fought off would be back, and they would be angrier than ever. Megan stumbled slightly, but Jacob caught her arm, pulling her along as they reached the edge of the property. Caleb and his team were already ahead of them, making their way toward a series of parked vehicles hidden behind a line of trees. Jacob had no idea where they were going, but he trusted Caleb. If there was anyone who knew how to get out of this mess, it was him. "We'll be safe," Caleb said, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they were following. "Just stay close, and don't stop moving." Jacob nodded, the adrenaline pumping through his veins as they continued their frantic flight. The headlights from the convoy illuminated the path ahead, and Jacob could see the fear in Megan's eyes. But there was something else too, hope. For the first time in days, he saw a flicker of something resembling peace in her expression. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. They reached the vehicles, and Caleb quickly ushered them inside one of the SUVs. As they pulled away from the property, Jacob glanced back at the house, now a blur in the distance. It wasn't over. Not yet. But they had survived. For now. As the car sped down the darkened road, Jacob felt a strange mix of relief and dread. They were free, but for how long? Caleb's team was skilled, but Jacob knew that the men they had just fought weren't the only ones searching for them. There were still more out there, more people who wouldn't stop until they had found them and silenced them for good. But as the miles passed and the lights of the town faded into the distance, Jacob allowed himself a moment to breathe. For the first time in days, he felt the weight on his chest ease, the burden of fear that had been suffocating him slowly lifting. Megan, sitting beside him, finally let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like forever. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something unspoken, but clear. They had made it this far, and no matter what happened next, they would face it together. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "For everything." Jacob squeezed her hand, a smile tugging at his lips. "We're not done yet," he said softly. "But we'll get through this. Together." The road ahead was uncertain, and the danger was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt like they had a shot at something better. And no matter what came next, he would fight for it, fight for Megan, for their future, for the life they had almost lost. They had survived the worst. And now, they were ready for whatever the world threw their way. And as they drove off into the night, Jacob knew one thing for certain: they weren't running anymore. They were finally ready to take back control.